Good afternoon. Welcome to AgileQuest Forum webinar training. Today's session is the Administrative Walkthrough, Part 2. My name is Lisa Harlock, and I'm a project manager here at AgileQuest, and I'll be leading the training today. And assisting me is Vashonda Short, who's a fellow project manager here at AgileQuest, and she'll be helping us out with questions and comments toward the end of the session. Before we move forward, I do want to remind everyone you have access to our support portal. This is located at success.agilequest.com, where you can find access to things like training videos, articles, FAQs, and more resources that you may find useful. If you have any trouble accessing the support portal, or if you've never accessed it before and need an account, please send an email to support@agilequest.com or let your project manager know if you're in an active implementation. For today's session, we're going to be building off of Part 1 and learning how to add and configure groups and permissions, add and configure users, and we'll also touch on the data management utility. This is our bulk loader, which allows you to make changes in bulk, add things in bulk, and even delete things in bulk. A link to this particular utility is shared in the chat box, so if you'd like to go ahead and download that utility and get it installed, you'll be able to follow along toward the end of the session. All right, and just a reminder, if you did not attend the first part of the walkthrough, there's another scheduled for next week, and everyone on this particular webinar will receive a follow-up email with a registration link to that. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and log into Forum, and we're going to just hop right into the administrative pages here by clicking the Settings button in the upper right-hand corner. We're going to talk about our first item for today, which is groups and permissions. After this, we're going to talk about the Users tab. We will also touch on the General tab, and then we'll go into the separate application, the Data Management Utility. But it makes sense first to talk about groups and permissions before we move on to users. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on Groups and Permissions, and much like the other tabs, you're going to have navigatable links to the left, and to the right, you'll be able to find your information. Now, if you don't see anything here and you've entered things, don't panic. All you need to do is hit the search button as it's waiting for your filters. If there are not any filters, just go ahead and click search. Alrighty, so since I'm in one of the demo environments that we use here at AgileQuest, there's quite a few asset groups. So let's talk about those first. An asset group, and you may recall this from the last session, it's required to create an asset. So all assets, which is anything that can be reserved in Forum, must reside in an asset group. You can think of an asset group as a container for assets. So if I take a look at the Boston Assets asset group here, I can see all of the different assets within this forum that are associated with this particular asset group. If I need to add an asset to an asset group, as assets can be in multiple asset groups, you can just click Add Asset, locate your assets. So let's say we're looking for Boston, and I would like to add a workspace or a collaboration space. I can click Search, check off the particular asset I need, and click Apply to also include it in this particular asset group. There is also a Check All button here too. And that's all an asset group does. So we can manipulate what happens with these asset groups via the use of user groups. So user groups is where all the power is. So clicking on user groups and then clicking search to bring up all, I can see the various user groups in this particular forum. Now, something to ask yourselves is, in your particular organization, will you have some offices that are only accessible by a certain part of your population? Or perhaps if you're a director, you have access to particular offices that other users do not. A way to separate this out in terms of who may reserve what space, for example, is determined through user groups. So if I click on the Boston group here, for example, I can see all of the users that have been added to this user group, and similarly to assets, users must have a user group attached. But if I go under permissions here to the left, I can see what the users included in the Boston user group have access to, so what their permissions are here. So I can see that they are attached to the Boston Asset Group, as this has been added previously, and they have all the permissions checked off here. So based on this, the Boston users will be able to reserve anything in the Boston user group. So let's say that I'd like to add multiple asset groups. Maybe you have some tenants that are allowed to reserve spaces in multiple areas or even multiple buildings. You can control that by defining permissions on assets. So if I select an asset group and define permissions by clicking this button here, I can decide, okay, well, I need an overflow space. I'm going to allow them to also reserve spaces in the coastal asset group. So I'll check off this box here and then select reserve and then click apply. And now everyone in the Boston user group also has access to anything in the coastal asset group. So this can be very useful if you're trying to separate out who may reserve what space. And a best practice would be to name your user groups something that makes sense to you and your organization. For example, going back to the example I used about a director having access to different offices than regular end users, it might be more manageable to call it a director's user group, followed by something like a director's offices asset group. That way, when you're tying the two together, there's no room for confusion. So in a nutshell, groups and permissions determine for your users who may reserve what space. Now, you do not have to use these. If your office is wide open, anyone can reserve anything anywhere, you can utilize our default groups. In particular, the all users group. So when your forum is created, you will notice that there are default groups that are already in the system. If I click on this, you can add a user just by clicking the Add User button here. And you can also do this upon creation of the user. And we can do so through the data management utility, which we'll learn about in a little bit. But if I go underneath the permissions, you're going to notice that in the default groups that are already created for you in Forum, that this is grayed out. It's not that you don't have permission to be able to edit these, but default groups in Forum are by default not allowed to be modified. So if you need a custom group, the best thing to do is just add new. Now, if you have additional questions on this, please let us know in the chat box, and you can find additional resources on our Success portal. But in a nutshell, again, groups and permissions allow you to decide what user may reserve which space. Okay, so now that we have that concept, we're going to talk about users. So I'm just going to click on the user tab here and click search to bring up all my users. Now, if you need to find a particular user, you can use any of these filters here, such as location, user role, first or preferred name, and so on. So I'm just going to locate myself here. Now, to add a new user, you have two options. You can add a user manually by clicking the Add a User link here, and you can begin filling out the required information. Or, as we'll learn later, you can add a whole bunch of users at once using our data management utility. But for now, we're going to pretend that I'm a brand new user in Forum and learn how to configure my profile. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my name here. And you can tell what the the required information is by these little blue asterisks. So these are required here. So as I create new users, I'm gathering this information, and it's always helpful to have this on hand. But you will need first name, last name, email address, language, status, and user group. So I've filled this all out, and there's also optional information you can add. So for work phone, mobile phone, you can add that in for your user. If there's an additional email address, and so on. You can also allow your users to be able to edit their own profile and add these things for you. Additionally, users can also add photos, just like when adding assets, by clicking the Add Photo button, going to your File Explorer, and exploring for the photo you would like to use, and then saving. Now, you'll notice below here the little private checkbox. In the first section of this series, we had discussed that if a user is private, they cannot be found using search for person. So if a user is uncomfortable or would like to opt out of the My Teams feature or being found by other users, they can check off the private checkbox here, and they will only be able to be found by an administrator. This is also best practice when you have service accounts in forums, such as for Exchange integration, to leave this as private so not to confuse any of your users. Location here, this is considered the user's home location. This does not have to equal their preference, which we'll talk about in a moment. And you can also, if you'd like to go the extra step, you could fill out information about department and title for this user using any of our canned responses. And below this, that same concept of active and inactive also carries over into users and forum. So just to recap what that means, if something is active, actions can be taken by it or upon it. If it is inactive, it will not be able to sign into forum or have actions taken upon it. So to give you a better example rather, let's say that you have a contractor that's in 6 months a year, and you know they'll be gone for 6, maybe over the winter, going into next year. Instead of deleting their profile from forum when you know they're coming back, you could simply make this inactive so that they would not be able to log into forum, no reservations could be made on their behalf, and so on. And then when they come back, merely flip them to active and they can begin signing in again. Below this, you'll also notice a locked and unlocked. If a user tries to log into forum in excess of 3 times unsuccessfully, their profile will lock. If they wait 5 minutes, it will unlock and allow them to try again, or they can reset their password. Now, if you're using SAML, for example, that's a different story, and we can coach you through that. But if they're using forum to log in without something like SAML SSO, this is where you would come to see if they were locked out. Alrighty. So now we'll walk through all of the different options that we have on a user. The next is user role and rights. Now, I also want to point out before I get too far as well, that when you're under a particular user, you are looking at this particular user's information. This does not affect any other user. If you need to change rights templates, we'll review that under the General tab. So firstly, let me talk about the different user roles inside of forum. User roles go in order of descending rights, with the administrator having all of the rights possible, followed by manager with a few less rights, and community manager with a few less rights from that, and then finally to the registered user. Now, I'm not going to change myself here because I need to continue to demo things for you guys, but we'll talk about that again under the General tab. But for now, what you'll need to know on this page is, let's say that you have a user that's a registered user and you'd like to give them a few more rights. Or perhaps they're a little bit elevated over in end user, but not quite a manager. You could come into their particular profile under their particular role and right and check off a box. So for example, if they have the ability, let's say we're going to give them some extra help to override maximum days in advance. You can check off this box for that user and they'll be able to obey that override rule. So they will have that ability now. All right. Next is business rules. So just like with assets, users also have business rules, and these are set per user. The first is maximum days in advance for reservations. Now you may be thinking to yourself, but wait, we have a maximum days in advance on an asset too. How does this work? Well, a rule to keep in mind in forum is that the most restrictive rule will win. So for example, this would be a way, let's say that you have some directors who are allowed to book reservations 60 days in advance, whereas your end users are only allowed 30 days in advance to book offices. A way that you could control that is to go into your directors' profiles, make sure that they are set to 60, for example, and then your end users set to 30, and then they will be obeyed. So the most restrictive rule is going to win. In your asset, you might have it set to 365 days in advance. But if a user's rule is more restrictive, like the 60 or the 30, an end user only is allowed to reserve out 30 days in advance, and your director's 60, that will be obeyed instead of the 365 set on the asset. So again, the most restrictive rule is going to win in that situation. Next is maximum number of simultaneous workspace reservations. This is the max number of reservations any user can have at one time under their profile. So this could be 1, this could even be 10. So a use for that could be, let's say that you have one particular project manager who she likes to make reservations for her team. So you might want to give her the ability to make 3 reservations at once. The downside of this is that the user's taking on 3 reservations, so you're not necessarily sure who utilized the other 2. So think about best practices in your organization as well. Next is bump and auto bump. You'll remember these from asset configuration. So if you'd like to have it so a user cannot be bumped or auto bumped, you can merely uncheck these and they will never be bumped. An example I use, let's say you have a CEO, an owner, you always know they're going to be at their particular meetings, but they may not always be on time and they may not remember to check in. If you want to prevent them from getting bumped, which is a manual bump done by an admin, or auto bump, which is anything automatically done by the forum, you could have these unchecked and that will never happen. Alrighty. Next is the user groups that we've talked about. So this is where you can see what particular user groups this user is assigned to, and you can add them to a group manually if needed from here. So there's 3 places again to add the user group: beneath the user's profile, beneath the user group in groups and permissions, and then also by using the data management utility. Next is list of reservations. So if I was already on this user's particular profile and I was curious what reservations they might have given my filter, I could see that very easily. But you will not be able to take actions under the list of reservations. So if you needed to bump someone's reservation, cancel someone's reservation, maybe they gave you a call and they asked for help checking in, you would take actions under the reservations tab rather than under the user's profile, as those actions will not be available here. User preferences. So user preferences are set by the user themselves. So let's take a moment away from this particular user profile, and I'm going to go into my own profile to show you where to find those. So I'm going to locate my name in the upper right-hand corner here, and I'm going to click on the little carrots, and I'm going to go to my profile. Then to the left, I'm going to go to my preferences. And here is where you and your users can set your preferences. Now this is different from the home location here for location. So let's say that my home location is Boston, but I'm going to be working in Richmond for a little while. I could set my preference to the downtown office in Richmond. That way when I log into Forum, the location and even the asset category are pre-populated for me. This saves me some time in the morning. Below this, I can also set my email notification preferences. So we find that a lot of our users have their staff ask things like, well, I just get too many emails from Forum. How do I turn those off for a little while? They can do so by coming underneath of their preferences and toggling from receive to do not receive. Now, if you do have a user coming to you saying, hey, I'm not getting my reservation confirmations, 2 things you should check first: the spam filter and also their preferences to make sure they haven't accidentally turned these off or forgotten that they turned these off. And that's user preferences. Also beneath your profile, you can go to the My Team link here, and this is where you would add people to your team. So you may recall from the first part of this session when we talked about the home page for Forum, at the very bottom is a list of your team members, and this is where you would add them. You would come beneath My Team, click Add User, and you could search for a particular user. So if I search for Jess, I could find Jess and add her. Now, if I'd like them to display on the home page, I can have them blue starred, or maybe I just work with them often, I invite them often, but they don't need to show up on my home page. I can uncheck the little star here, and now Jay will not appear on my home page, but when I go to make reservations, he'll be in my quick invite list. Okay, now I'm going to go back to settings, to users, to my profile, and to the next item, which is phone information. So phone information is used if you're using the Cisco phone switching integration. If you're not, you can ignore this page, but if you are, we'll be working with you to learn how to use this. Beneath this is user credentials. If you're utilizing a badge swipe, this is where we would have your badge number entered. And if you are using SAML SSO, this is where your SAML credential would go. For more information on these particular integrations, you can find these on our Success portal, or you can reach out to your project manager or to the support team. Now, let's say a user comes to you and they can't figure out how to reset their Forum password. you can come into their profile and quickly click the reset password link here, and this will reset the password for the user. And then finally, if you need to delete a user from the forum, you can click Archive User. Now just be careful, because again, this is another red text pop-up. This is an irreversible process. So if you accidentally delete someone, you'll just need to recreate their profile to bring them back. All right, so that's everything for user configuration. If you have any questions, please let us know. Now let's touch on the General tab. The General tab has some global settings. And today what I'd like to focus on is the role and rights templates. So we had just talked about how the administrator has the most power, going in order of descending rights. But what's important to know about the General tab and the role and right templates is this is where you should decide with your team what rights everyone in your organization will have access to. So for example, if I go down to the registered user, I can see what rights the registered users in my forum have. So this is your everyday guy just coming in, making reservations for he or herself. So let's say that in my organization, I would like the user to also be able to manage their own credentials. I could check that box off. Or if I know that I'm going to be using SAML, I'd like to override the password expiration so the user never has to expire, never has their forum password expire. I can do that here. Just keep in mind that this is not retroactive. So when a user comes in that's new, brand new for the first time, the forum is looking at this template to know what rights to assign them. Now there is no bulk way to change rights. So please, before you begin adding users, take a look at the rights just to make sure everything's going to work for you. This is a lot easier than having to do any recreations. Alrighty, so now we're going to take a look at the data management utility. So again, that link has been shared with you all in the chat box today. And first, let's talk about what this is. The data management utility is an application that is separate a forum that you will download and install on your machine. You will log into it using your forum login. This application does not support SAML, so you must have your forum login, and it is only for use by administrators. So even if an end user were to get a hold of this application, they would not be able to log in. Alrighty, so this is our bulk loader. This is a fabulous tool that allows you to make bulk changes to locations, assets, and users. I primarily see this used to add all of your assets at once and all of your users at once when you're ready to go live. So first, let's go ahead and click on the Asset button here. And I can see my three options beneath Asset Management: Add New, Modify Existing, and Archive. Add New speaks for itself, followed by Modify Existing. So let's say a year down the road, you all decide to change some business rules on your assets. Instead of having to go one by one through your assets, which could be quite a few, you could download a Modify Existing template. So if you download asset data here, you could make your changes under the business rules. Maybe it's something as simple as you're closing an hour earlier. Make that change in the template. Only make that change in the template. Click Upload Asset Data, upload your CSV, and in a matter of minutes, all your changes have been made without having to go manually through each asset. That's pretty valuable. You can also add your new asset. You would come into the DMU, download the template, fill out the required information, and then upload. Now I'd like to show you a couple of these templates to get you started. I also want to let you know that we're planning an advanced UMP session next quarter to really focus in on these particular items. All right, first let's look at the Add Assets template. So this is a CSV template that I've downloaded from the data management utility and filled out with the required information. You can also find these templates if you'd like to reference them in the materials that were sent to you in an email when you registered for this particular session. So here you can download things like workspaces, cubicles, collaboration spaces, even services and equipment all at once in one click. Now, a rule of thumb for these is if you have an excess of 10 items to put into forum, use the CSV. If it's less than 10, you might want to do that manually. And the reason I say this is there is some work when you put in this information. So not only do you have to put in the information you'll need, but as I slide right, you'll notice you can put in things like business rules, open, close, and at the end, there is some formatting. So just make sure that when you are creating these CSV templates that you follow the formatting for a price and asset group. This is where I see people get tripped up the most because there is a little bit of a funny formatting here. So we just have, for example, the curly brackets. If you're never sure of which particular type of formatting to use, you can always download a modification template, which will have all the proper formatting already filled out for you, and you can copy it. But you'll be able to add things in bulk this way. Now let me show you the modification template. So here is an example modification template. I've downloaded this from Forum with everything already nicely filled out for me. So let's say that all I need to do is change an opening time. I can slide to the right here, and I'm going to change my close time. Let's say that it's 6 p.m. I can change that and then drag, which makes it a lot easier than having to go manually one by one. So this is a really great thing to have, especially if you're new to Forum and you're setting things up for the first time. Saves you lots of time. So once I've made my change, I can then upload this template and that will be changed in the Forum for me. Now scrolling to the right as well, I'd like to point out, since this is the modification template, this is also where you can find QR codes. So we do support QR codes for Forum. If you're unsure of how to use those, please see our Success portal for the walkthrough. But you're able to then grab out your QR code URL and generate a QR code for things. This is really great, and we see a lot of our users use this, print it out, and stick it to a desk. It's as easy as printing this out on a piece of printer paper and laminating it. So a great idea for people to quickly be able to book reservations. Now, finally, I'd like to show you an example of an add user template. So as you get closer and closer to go live and rolling out to your users, it's going to be a lot easier for you to go ahead and fill out one of these user CSVs, which, by the way, you can do this at any time, and the earlier the better. But you can fill these out with your users' information, including things like user groups. You can add multiple groups as well just by using a comma. What the role is, you could add registered users, administrators, managers, and so on. And to the right, required information. Let's say that you're using SAML SSO. And fill out the SAML credentials here, for example, and business rules. Now, if you're a super nice administrator, you might want to actually go ahead and fill out the location preference and asset category preference for the user. So let's say that you already know that all your Boston users are going to prefer the Boston location and probably workspaces. You could fill this out for them, and it will already be filled out when they join. You cannot modify preferences after a user is added, and you can only modify user preferences using this CSV template. So just to show you what a preference looks like, since I've been talking about it so much, I'm going to go back to Forum, and you can see that this is filled out for me, location and workspace, and that's where those preferences populate. Now, before using the DMU, I would highly recommend, if you have never entered anything into Forum before, to please try the data entry manually, That way you know what to expect and what some of the columns inside of the CSV template mean. That will help you out. Alrighty. So that is actually all of our material for today. We got through that rather quickly. So I'd like to take a pause here and allow you to put in any questions that you might have for me today so that we could go over those. But Shauna, I'm not sure if you've received any already.
No questions as of yet, but we'll wait a few moments just to get them in, and we'll kind of go from there. All right, thanks everybody for submitting questions. We have received a few. The first question is, can asset names be duplicated?
That's a great question. So asset names can be duplicated if they're in different locations. So what I mean by this is, if you have two Office Ones, like you can see here in this listing, if you have two Office Ones, that's allowed as long as they're in two separate locations. You cannot duplicate names of offices within the same location. That's a great question.
Thank you. The next question is, what report will show me how many reservations there were on my conference room in the last quarter?
Sure. So that would actually be located in our analytics session of the forum. So if I go click on analytics, you'll be able to load in and see our reports. Now we will have a session on this in the future, so don't be afraid if you've never accessed our analytical reports before. And you will need to make sure that the permission structure is also set up within analytics to be able to bring these things up as well. Now it's been a minute since I've been in, so it takes just a moment for me to load. Okay, I can click on reports, and you have a couple of different options. If you would like to see this in a visual report, I would recommend using, for example, the asset utilization report or the usage snapshot, which is my personal favorite, but you could also go into a reservation list report and sort this by a quarter. But I'd like to show you the usage snapshot, as I think this provides the best results. So I'll click view here, and this report will be generated. And I can then filter by the particular quarter that I'd like to see.
Thank you. One more. If an asset is set to 365 days in advance, but the user's profile is set to 3 days in advance, how does this work?
That's great. So that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier too. So if an asset is set to 365 days in advance, but the user's profile is set to 3 days in advance, the 3 days in advance will win. So remember, the most restrictive rule wins in forum. So when the user comes in to make a reservation, they'll only be allowed to do so 3 days in advance, as it's more restrictive than the 365 days.
All right, that looks like the last question we received. We can wait another minute or two just to see if there's any others, and if not, we can go ahead and close it out.
All right, well, looks like we don't have any additional questions to answer today. If you do find that you have some questions after the session, please reach out to your project manager if you're in an active implementation, or you can shoot an email over to support@agilequest.com. Appreciate your attention today, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.